The Night of the Ape-Men, July 1924. The Vander White Claim. The dense forest surrounding the Vander White Claim was cloaked in a thick, unnerving silence that evening, unlike anything the miners had ever experienced. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet that follows a heavy snowfall or the calm after a storm. No, this was something far darker and more profound. Nestled in the shadows of the brooding Mount St. Helens, the land had always held a kind of wild, untamed beauty, but tonight that same beauty seemed to be tainted, twisted. As the sun began its slow descent behind the jagged peaks of the mountain, the sky shifted from a fiery blend of orange and pink into a suffocating inky purple. The last rays of light seemed to wither and evaporate as if recoiling from some hidden malevolent presence, something that had taken hold of the land and was now holding it in an iron grip. The air was thick with an unnatural heaviness, like the earth itself was struggling to breathe. Even the usual breeze that stirred the treetops had vanished, leaving behind an oppressive calm that seemed to weigh down upon the men working in the valley below. The sound of nature, the chirping of birds, the scurrying of small animals, the whisper of the wind had all but disappeared. The forest was silent, save for the occasional eerie creak of the ancient firs and pines that towered like silent sentinels above the landscape. Their gnarled trunks cast long, twisting shadows, their limbs seeming to reach out like fingers from some unseen, otherworldly entity in the gathering dusk. Fred Beck wiped his brow with a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against the back of his neck in a subconscious attempt to relieve the creeping discomfort that had settled there. His muscles ached from a full day's labor, the weariness of the work evident in every stiff joint and strained tendon. But there was something else in the air, something that gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. It wasn't just physical exhaustion, it was a deep, unsettling feeling that he couldn't quite explain. A feeling that the land itself was watching, waiting. He had spent years in these mountains, working the claims alongside his partner Hank Davis, and living among men who had learned to thrive in the unforgiving wilderness. But tonight, the wilderness felt different. It was as if it were hiding something ancient and dangerous, something that had been lying dormant until now, waiting for the right moment to make its presence known. Fred stood motionless for a moment, his eyes scanning the dimming horizon. The trees, which had always felt like old friends, now seemed alien, their dark shapes shifting uneasily in the growing gloom. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, that they were being watched. Hank Davis, seated on a large jagged rock nearby, shifted his weight and adjusted the rifle resting across his knee. The campfire crackled and popped, casting fleeting, dancing shadows across his broad shoulders. Hank's piercing blue eyes never left the tree line, even as he appeared to be lost in thought. The man's face was etched with years of hard living and near-constant alertness, his steely gaze honed by the demands of frontier life. He had seen things in the wild that made him wary of the forest in ways Fred couldn't fully comprehend. But tonight, Hank's usual calm seemed strained. His eyes, usually sharp and clear, now darted anxiously from shadow to shadow. The muscle in his jaw twitched every now and then, a sure sign that something was bothering him, something beyond the usual weariness of a day spent working in the hills. "Something's wrong," Hank muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible, as though speaking aloud might make the growing tension even more real. His eyes narrowed as they flicked to the trees once more, his grip tightening around the barrel of his rifle. Fred chuckled, though the sound was dry and humorless. "You've been saying that all week, Hank. Ain't no animal I know of makes tracks like the ones we've been seeing." Hank shook his head slowly, his gaze fixed intently on the distant tree line. "That ain't just tracks, Fred. It's something else. I've got a feeling in my gut. You feel it too, don't you? Like we're being watched." Fred hesitated, the words caught in his throat. He didn't want to admit it, but Hank's words struck too close to a truth he didn't want to. Acknowledge. The air felt thick, charged with an unseen energy that made his skin crawl. It wasn't just the silence. It was the way the trees seemed to close in around them, the way the forest seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something. Fred scanned the trees again, the shadows seeming to stretch out toward him, deeper and darker than before. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and his heart skipped a beat. He stepped back instinctively, his fingers tightening around the rifle's stock. "You're just spooked," Fred muttered, trying to steady his breath and shake off the growing unease. He ran a hand through his damp hair, trying to regain some sense of control. "We've been working this claim for months, never had a problem." Hank didn't respond immediately, but Fred could see the tension in his partner's posture, the way his hand gripped the rifle just a little tighter. After a long pause, Hank spoke, his voice a low growl, almost reverent in its seriousness. "Maybe, but I've been out here long enough to know when something's off." Fred turned his gaze toward the trail that led back to their cabin. The small log cabin they'd built by hand was just a mile away, nestled deep in the forest. A modest structure, with a stone chimney that always offered warmth after a long day. It had always felt like home, a place of safety, but tonight it seemed distant and unreachable. The trees around the path, once familiar, now seemed to loom larger, their branches stretching out like skeletal fingers, casting grotesque shadows that reached hungrily toward them. The forest, which had always been a comforting presence, now felt menacing, hostile. Fred couldn't shake the sense that they were being followed, that the land itself had turned against them. "We'll finish up here and head back," Fred said, trying to sound confident, though his voice wavered slightly. "It's getting dark anyway, still a few miles to go." Hank nodded but didn't speak. Instead, he stood, his rifle resting easily in his hands, his eyes scanning the darkening wilderness with the practiced calm of someone who had lived too long in the wild. Without another word, the two men began to move down the narrow, winding trail that led toward the spring, each step feeling heavier than the last. The dense underbrush rustled beneath their boots, and the snapping of twigs seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. Every sound in the forest felt amplified, every rustling leaf a potential threat, every shadow a lurking danger. As they neared the clearing by the spring, the first hint of unease turned into a bone-deep certainty. They were not alone. Without warning, a low, sharp whistle pierced the silence, unlike anything either man had ever heard. It was shrill, high-pitched, and almost wrong. The sound seemed to vibrate in the air, cutting through the night with a precision that made Fred's blood run cold. Hank's hand shot out, gripping Fred's arm with an iron-tight hold. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice filled with urgency, barely a breath. Fred nodded, his heart racing as he tried to keep his composure. "Ain't no animal I know of makes a sound like that." Before they could react, another whistle echoed from across the ridge, even sharper and more unnatural than the first. It was as if something were mocking them, playing with them like a predator toying with its prey. "Stay low," Hank hissed, his voice barely audible as he began to creep toward the spring, moving with the stealth of a hunter. Fred followed closely behind, the weight of his rifle heavy in his hands, his senses stretched to their limits. And then they saw it. A massive creature, easily 7 feet tall, stood just beyond the clearing, framed by the towering pines. It was covered in thick, dark fur that shimmered in the dim light, rippling with each movement of its powerful limbs. The creature's arms hung loosely at its sides, and Fred could see the muscles flex beneath its fur, each movement deliberate and unnervingly fluid. Its face, part man, part beast, was grotesque, a twisted fusion of humanity and something far older. The wide, flat nose, the sharp eyes that gleamed with intelligence and awareness. There was no mistaking it. This was no bear, no wild animal. It was something else, something ancient, something beyond comprehension. For a long moment, neither man moved, frozen in place by the sheer terror of the sight before them. The creature seemed to sense their presence, its sharp eyes locking onto Fred's as though it were sizing them up, evaluating them. And then, in a fluid motion that defied the bulk of its body, the creature disappeared behind a tree, vanishing into the shadows. Hank was the first to react. Without hesitation, he raised his rifle and fired. The shot echoed through the clearing, followed by another, then a third. But the creature had already vanished into the forest, its speed almost impossible to comprehend. Fred's heart pounded in his chest as he fired a few more shots in desperation, but it was already gone, swallowed by the darkness. "Damn it!" Fred shouted, his voice strained with fear and frustration. "We've got to get back to the cabin." Hank didn't say a word, his eyes already scanning the dark tree line, his rifle still ready at his side. He nodded grimly. "We need to move. Now." Without another word, the two men turned and ran, fear driving them forward at a pace that left them breathless even before they reached the cabin. The forest seemed to close in around them, the darkness pressing against them like a living thing. Every crack of a twig underfoot, every rustling in the underbrush seemed to be the sound of something stalking them. They ran with everything they had, the cabin growing ever closer. When they finally burst through the door, they were met by the anxious faces of their companions, George, John, and Roy. All three men were armed, rifles in hand, their faces pale with worry. "What happened?" George demanded, his voice thick with disbelief. Hank, gasping for breath, slammed the door behind them. "Saw one of them," he said, his voice ragged. "Took a shot." Roy, barely 20 years old, looked confused. "One of what?" "Ape men," Fred replied, his voice hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "Bigger than any bear I ever seen." John, silent but steady, began loading his rifle with practiced efficiency. "We leavin'?" Hank shook his head, his face grim. "Not yet. It's too dark. We stay here until first light." The tension in the cabin was palpable. Every man kept their rifle close, their eyes darting from shadow to shadow, listening intently for any sign of movement outside. The fire crackled in the hearth, offering little comfort against the palpable fear that had taken root in their hearts. The minutes stretched into hours, the silence outside only broken by the occasional snap of a twig or the wind whispering through the trees. But it wasn't the wind that chilled Fred's bones. It was the constant gnawing feeling that something was waiting out there, something that had no intention of letting them leave. Then, just past midnight, the first thud shook the cabin, a deep, earth-shuddering sound. It came from outside. The second thud came almost immediately after, followed by several more, each one growing louder, each one sending a deep, reverberating tremor through the ground. "They're here," Hank whispered, his voice tight with fear. "Get ready." And then, the assault began. The first rock hit the roof with a deafening crash, then another, followed by several more, each one heavier than the last. The walls of the cabin groaned under the impact, the structure seeming to shudder with each blow. Fred's heart raced, his pulse thundering in his ears. The creatures outside were relentless, throwing boulders, slamming against the walls, their cries echoing through the night. It was like nothing Fred had ever heard before, shrieks and howls that sounded like they were born of a nightmare. "They're trying to break in," John shouted, his voice trembling with panic. Hank didn't hesitate. "Fire!" The cabin erupted in gunfire, the men unloading their rifles into the walls, trying to drive the creatures away. The roar of gunshots mingled with the screeches of the beasts outside, but still the assault continued, hour after hour. The door shook under the pressure, threatening to give way. The walls splintered under the constant barrage of boulders and fists. Finally, as dawn's first light began to break through the trees, the assault stopped. The forest fell eerily silent once more. With guns still raised, the men cautiously stepped outside. The ground was littered with large stones, and deep, massive footprints had been left in the soft earth. But Fred's blood ran cold when he saw the figure standing at the cliff's edge. Tall, hulking, with dark, intelligent eyes that locked onto his for a brief moment before the creature turned and disappeared into the forest. Fred's hand shook as he raised his rifle and fired 3 quick shots. The creature staggered, letting out one last haunting cry before tumbling over the cliffside, disappearing into the chasm below. The silence that followed was deafening. Hank turned to the others, his voice low but urgent. "We leave. Now." Without a word, the men grabbed what little they could carry and fled the cabin. They left their claim, their tools, their hard-won gold behind. The legend of Ape Canyon had been born that night, and the men knew, whatever they had encountered, whatever had haunted these woods, they would never be the same. The forest, once their home, had become a place of nightmares, a place where the veil between man and beast was terrifyingly thin. And the ape men, as they were later called, had made sure their mark would be remembered for generations to come. As the men fled the Vander claim, their boots echoing against the rugged forest floor, the terror they had witnessed that night was still fresh in their minds. The wilderness that had once been their workplace, their home, now felt like a land out of time, hostile, ancient, and full of horrors beyond their comprehension. They left behind their claim, the promise of riches, and the safety of the cabin they had built with their own hands. The forest had reclaimed it all, and the men knew they would never return. The legend of the ape men, born that fateful night in 1924, would become an eerie tale whispered among miners, hunters, and adventurers who dared to venture into the shadows of Meet St. Helens. The fear that gripped Fred, Hank, and the others never fully left them, and their story became one of the many mysterious tales from the American frontier, a tale of a creature that bridged the divide between man and beast. The sightings of the ape men persisted for decades, with other hunters and explorers reporting encounters in the dense forests around Mount St. Helens and the surrounding areas. Some said they had seen large hulking figures moving swiftly through the trees, while others spoke of strange, guttural sounds echoing through the woods at night. But no one ever brought back solid proof of the creatures, and as time passed, the story began to fade into the realm of local legend and folklore. In recent years, however, the ape men legend has resurfaced, spurring new interest from cryptozoologists, researchers, and conspiracy theorists. Some have suggested that the creatures encountered by Fred and Hank were a remnant population of an undiscovered species of hominid, possibly a type of Bigfoot or Sasquatch. The thick, dark fur, the hulking size, and the human-like features of the creatures seem to align with descriptions from other sightings of Bigfoot-like creatures in the Pacific Northwest. Modern theories about the ape men also point to the possibility of an undiscovered subspecies of early humans, such as Neanderthals or Denisovans, surviving in isolated pockets deep within the forests of North America. This would explain the apparent intelligence and human-like features of the creatures, as well as their elusive nature, evading detection by modern humans for so long. Other researchers propose that the creatures could be the result of some form of genetic mutation, possibly linked to the area's volcanic activity. which could have created a unique environment in which these creatures developed and thrived undetected. Skeptics, of course, dismiss the legend as a combination of superstition, misidentifications of animals, and a touch of imagination run wild. They argue that the creatures Fred and Hank encountered were likely bears or other large mammals that the men mistook for something far more sinister. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, the mystery persists. Whether the ape men were the product of an overactive frontier imagination or the remnants of a forgotten species, the legend endures. And for those who venture into the forests near Mount St. Helens, the story remains a cautionary tale. They say the ape men still watch from the shadows, waiting for the next unwitting traveler to stumble too deep into the wilderness, a place where man and beast no longer clearly divide, and where the unknown lurks just beyond the edge of human understanding.